Hello, I'm Will and I'm the head gardener at this place, Forbidden Fruit and Veg. And yeah, I'll just take you around the veg in the garden. So to start with, this is the brassica area. It's gone through a lot of changes this year. So at the beginning of the year, it probably was our best start to the year for brassicas. It was quite a cold, wet start to the spring and beginning of summer, which was very bad for a lot of the tunnel crops and the summer crops like courgettes, cucumbers and tomatoes, but very good for brassicas. And luckily we had a lot planted out quite early in big kind of modules, raised up and planted out so that they avoided slugs mostly. But now, later on in the season, they've been massively affected by cabbage white butterflies. They've started to really strip back the kaleets and the Brussels sprouts here, but now we're starting to have a bit of a kind of revival from the parasitic wasps, which are kind of buzzing around here nicely. And so they lay their eggs into the caterpillar. Once they're ready, the caterpillar goes to the underside of the leaf and kind of attaches itself, and then the eggs of the parasitic wasp will pop out, in doing so killing the caterpillar. That's the kind of natural form of pest control that we try and employ. I don't buy in any controls and I don't spray anything onto the plants other than occasional kind of seaweed juice and some homemade comfrey juice. They've been massively weakened by the caterpillar this year. Our usual other ways of protecting them are just netting, which also serves as a protection against the pigeons, and try and hope for birds to come in and eat the caterpillars, but there's not been that many birds in the garden this year, and I wonder if that's to do with there's been a bit of a drop in the insects, especially noticeable this year, with a big drop in kind of butterfly and wasp numbers. The main butterfly that seems to be happy this year is the cabbage white butterfly, and not really seen a lot of others around, which this type of garden should be helping with because it's a very diverse garden. We leave stuff to go to flower later in the season, providing a lot of nectar and pollen for those creatures, whereas kind of the surrounding areas is sprayed with all sorts of pesticides and kind of insect killers essentially. I've been leaving some things to go to seed entirely, so the tall green stuff over there with the bamboo canes is perpetual spinach. It's a type of leaf beet related to chard, and so that's now starting to dry off, and once we have a few dry days we'll harvest the seed from there, and that should give us enough seed for kind of like 2 or 3 years really. And behind, which is now looking a little bit more dead, the bamboo canes there are parsnip seeds. So for that we picked the parsnips out of the ground last year, chose whichever one seemed the nicest shape, length, and had grown well without much disease, and planted them here in spring this year, and they've now gone into like a big flowering shoot and produced lots of seed, which we harvested. And I've also got a mix of radishes and some outdoor tomatoes. Yeah, I tried to do a lot of seed saving. I was on the Gaia Foundation put on a year-long training program, which I took part in last year. And so this year I've been trying to just carry it on by doing as much seed saving as possible. This year for our tomatoes, like 90% of the tomatoes that we've grown are from home saved seed. Yeah, so the way we've been taking on new land so far in the garden has been by growing potatoes in an area that is incredibly weedy, just as a means of kind of cultivation. You can do quite deep weed removal of quite kind of heavy nettle roots and couch grass and dock, just in the process of kind of creating the trough for the potatoes and then ridging and that whole process, and then harvesting. It's quite, you end up cultivating the ground a lot. And so this whole section up against the wall used to be kind of 6-foot high nettles. And so early this spring, we started clearing those, planting potatoes, and then we harvested them about a month ago. And so now that area is completely clear, it's leveled, and I've just sown a mix of green manure species. So that has Phacelia buckwheat, and then a mix of clovers and a little bit of ryegrass for a bit of winter cover. Also in that area we have the fruit trees up against the wall, so it's trying to make as much use of the space as possible. These specifically are for east facing walls, so there's some cherry varieties and a couple hardier pear varieties, which should do well with the east facing aspect. So behind the leafy stuff there, which is chard and perpetual spinach, we have a little flower bed. It wasn't quite enough of a square bed to put into vegetables, so it's quite nice to use areas like that for flowers, mainly for pollen, but also to attract beneficial insects. They can be a good source of nectar for hoverflies, and they can also be a good distraction plant, essentially, for things like aphids, especially for nasturtium. Some of them can also be used as dried cut flowers, which look quite nice, so the straw flowers are good for that. And some can be put into the salad bags as edible flowers, so the calendula and nasturtium and a bit of borage are best for that, as well as a bit of cornflower. Just in front of the flower bed we have chard and perpetual spinach. In front of that, which is just behind the blue line of Cavolo Nero, behind that we have beds of rocket that we've direct sown and mustard. So then coming in front of the Cavolo Nero we have red curly kale and then green curly kale. And then we have bulb fennel and then spring onions. And under this cover we have cauliflower. So we've tried to keep as much of the brassicas as we can under cover while the cabbage white butterfly are out to protect them. But we just didn't quite have enough cover to completely protect against everything. And then further through we have courgettes and patipans. These are undersown with a mix of green manure plants. I've tried to use quite tall growing. I did sow clover, but it's not come up quite so well, and the courgette has outcompeted it quite quickly this year. But there is some nice tall growing flax, buckwheat and phacelia, which are also really good nectar sources for the insects, and you can see a lot of kind of bee action around on the phacelia and the buckwheat especially, and that also just helps bring in those pollinators to the courgette flowers so that you get a much higher success rate of pollination, because sometimes you can, especially earlier in the season, or if there is just a lack of pollinators, you can end up with quite kind of malformed courgettes where they have quite a soft end, and that can often be due to incomplete pollination. It can also be due to lack of water, but it can be, partly having good pollination can really help have good crop yields. And so in this area there's a continuation of our brassica section. So under the cover over here we have our winter kales, which are often kind of early summer sown and planted out a few weeks later for winter cropping. So these we'll be harvesting off these kind of more October, November, and then hopefully through till March next year. And then we also have cabbages and red curly kale. This bed of kale is now getting quite tall, and so this is one that we probably would have sown in spring and planted out a little bit later, like late spring. And we've already had a lot of harvest off this, kind of a lot of leaves of kale. And then this here will be purple sprout and broccoli. That will be, we'll be harvesting off this hopefully more like March, April next year. And that just gives us our kind of year-round cropping, essentially. We're trying to have a good amount of veg coming out of the garden throughout the year. So even though this is quite a slow growing crop and isn't necessarily always very high yielding, it gives you a crop in the times of the year where there isn't much else. And then going further around, in front of the courgettes we have salad that's kind of now going to its seed stage, so it's bolting, and that we've already had a lot of harvests off, a lot of kilos, and eventually we'll clear that and probably put some on the compost and some to the chickens. And then in front is the rocket and mustard bed, which we've harvested from a lot already. And in front of that is the chicory, which is kind of our winter salad addition. Normally outdoor lettuce leaves start to lose their quality kind of toward the end of October. And so at that time, October, November, December is when the chicory becomes a really important thing. It's very cold hardy, it can survive frosts, and sometimes it even tastes a bit better after a frost. It loses a bit of its bitterness and becomes a bit sweeter. And so that's when the chicory becomes very important in the salad mixes. And the salad mix is a very important part of this. Like the salad and the kale are probably our biggest money makers essentially. You need those things on a small market garden to be making it close to profitable, because they yield a lot per area, whereas the purple sprout and broccoli has much lower yields per area, but you're trying to make this balance of kind of profitability versus kind of year-round production at all times. This area is a line of apple trees mixed with some quite now rampant cardoons, which we should probably trim down a bit, but they're incredible habitat, and the seeds from them are incredible for a lot of different birds through winter. And in front of there we have rhubarb. We've been kind of splitting the crowns of this rhubarb most winters now to try and increase the area we have, so we've planted some in other areas of the garden. Okay, so this area is the bean area, and then we've got the chennapods and carrots in front of us. This year we're growing a lot of runner beans, French beans and borlotti beans. This section specifically is our seed saving area of the beans, and so here we've got a variety of French bean called Cobra, which is just generally very well producing and high yielding and quite disease resistant. And it's one that I've saved a seed from a couple of years now, and this will be its third season, and the borlottis are in their second season. And underneath we've got Phacelia and clover as a underlying green manure to try and keep the ground covered. Once the beans die back in October, some of this should keep the soil alive with roots essentially. In front of us we have the more chard and perpetual spinach, and then a big carrot bed. And this is inside the current base of a new polytunnel. So we've just been putting in the foundations. So there's no concrete because it's quite a protected area in the walled garden. But once this polytunnel is up, it will be kind of our final polytunnel structure. This will be our sixth one. That will kind of mark, kind of the end of the kind of setup phase of the garden, I think. This is now my third year. By the end of this year, we should have kind of all the structures complete and all the irrigation fixed up, and be in a position so that next year it can be more about making it more efficient and focusing on selling and marketing. It takes a bit of time to set up a market garden. Even though this is only an acre and a half, it's taken a lot of labour. This is where market gardens can struggle if they are needing to pay for all that labour in the setup phases. You're not managing to sell that much while expanding everything. You can't build and sort out your irrigation and increase your bed space while also selling crops and generating income. So those initial phases are very tricky periods where you can be quite reliant on unpaid labour. So we're set up with WWOOF as an organisation, which are incredible, and everyone that comes here is always very happy to be here. They learn a lot from it. I think as long as it is a reciprocal thing and they are learning and enjoying their time here, then it feels very fair. WWOOF is called Willing Workers on Organic Farms, and they are a kind of voluntary charity that links people looking for a way to help out farmers or to just experience life in the countryside, to get out of the cities or towns and to kind of experience a different way of life that's not kind of being in an office surrounded by pollution or whatever. It's a really beneficial thing for both sides. So in exchange, so we kind of teach them. I make sure to be patient and explain enough around the farm. So it's a teaching thing. We completely feed them completely organic food, and they get to live in the house with us. Everyone has their own room. They work with us together in a garden, doing about 6 hours of work a day for 4 days a week. The jobs that they're doing are very mixed through the day, so there's harvesting and seed sowing, seed saving, and kind of preserving some of the harvests for winter. As a paid worker, it doesn't quite make sense for me to be spending lots of time preserving when we have a glut at this time in the season, where we have lots of tomatoes or courgettes or patipans and onions. The WWOOFers are usually very happy to be kind of preserving that for the winter, and so it makes it into more of a community feel rather than kind of something that needs to fit within this kind of capitalist economic system that we have. It kind of sits outside of that and exists, in a different way of life, really. And in this area, it's a continuation of the bean section, but we've interspersed it with a few beds of celeriac and celery. This has always been a really good crop for us. It keeps in the ground throughout winter, and this time we've sown in between the lines with clover so that once we harvest the celeriac, there's still something living in the ground over winter. Celeriac's a great crop. It's also one that provides that year-round harvest. You can use the leaves for stews, and the celeriac itself for a variety of things. And so behind us is the runner beans, and so those have the distinctive red flowers. In front of that is perpetual spinach, which is looking very lush at the moment. Perpetual spinach gives us a much better crop throughout the season than the more classic true spinach. It's a lot hardier, it's a bit more resistant to slugs. The slugs don't seem to like it quite as much. It's quite a high yielder for us and it's very valuable. And in this section behind the runner beans, we've got a bed of sweet corn, which we've planted quite densely because it needs to be close to each other to get well pollinated. So it produces a flowering stalk up high, and so you need it in a good dense area so that the wind can spread the pollen between itself, and kind of you get a good then set cob of corn. In front of that we've got more perpetual spinach, and in front of that is a newly created bed, so we're expanding a bit more into this area. So this one we've dug out a lot of couch grass, and now it's been sown with a mix of phacelia and buckwheat, which have been shown to have allelopathic qualities which can kind of reduce the ability of other plants to grow. So it should in theory restrict the growth of the couch and also provide cover over winter, so roots in the ground, which is always beneficial for soil health. Here is slightly unorthodox, unusual use of logs. So we happen to have a lot of logs that were left over after mushroom production, and we've dug out trenches here because this area had quite historically very poor drainage, and so by digging out trenches in the pathways, we've raised the beds, which helps with the drainage itself, but then we've also filled those pathways with a mixture of wood chip or logs or a combination of the both, whatever we can get our hands on, which has just helped massively with moisture retention in summer, but then also allowing it to flow out a bit in winter. And so it's also about improving the soil health, and this would help also with kind of mycorrhizal fungi activity in and around the beds. And so next we're going to do the same with this bed, and then one more, and then the rest will be a pond and a bed of willow which should help protect the polytunnel from the wind. So it will act as a windbreak, a bit of biomass, and act as quite a good source of pollination from the willow catkins. And also it could be used as like a secondary income as like basketry willow or other uses in the garden. So this area is the entrance to the garden, and so it's nice to have flowers right at the beginning. So we've got a big diversity of flowers. Some are just for kind of pollinator attraction, so it's currently, even though it's late in the day, the sun's on them, but there's a lot of insects and wasps and bees and everything buzzing around. So this is kind of mixed use, I guess. We could use them for cut flowers, but they're just nice to have visually here. And we also have a lot of borage, calendula and nasturtium for adding to the salad bags. And beyond that, we have a bed of squash, which look really productive, and we've got some nice kind of ripe squash already growing there. This is one of the polytunnels. It's in quite a wild state at the moment, but that is semi-intentional. I feel like it's better to have a lot more plant cover at the base below your crop plants, just to try and keep soil health active and just have a diversity of life there, really. So we've got some lemon balm that's self-seeded. I've just let that be, and then some calendula amongst the aubergines here. And we also have wood sorrel, which is a type of oxalis, which you can add to salad for like a bit of a lemony flavour in small quantities. And it's also been shown to have a beneficial effect on things like red spider mite. So it attracts a predator that will go for the spider mite. And on this side we have winter squash. So I wouldn't normally put this in the polytunnel, but we had a free bed this year and we had some plants left over. And so this is mostly butternut, which if there's a good season, it can grow well outdoors, but in a poorer summer, indoors you can get a good harvest of butternut, because it's usually grown in Spain, which is where the UK gets most of its squash. It's still not kind of gotten used to the diversity that you can have from small scale farms, and so we're still seeing in supermarkets only the butternuts that you get from Spain, whereas you can produce a much bigger variety. And that's currently spreading into the next door beds. We should probably start to prune it a bit, but in here we've got bell peppers, and then following on tomatoes, some beefsteak varieties and some cherry varieties, and then basil behind. And so some of the stuff that's on the ground is intentionally planted. So we've got some red tagetes and some calendula, but there's a lot of stuff that's just come up on its own and is just quite a nice thing to have. So we've got a greater leaf plantain, some comfrey, some borage, some flax, and some vetch, and amongst many other things. But it just feels very alive in here, rather than having some places that are very large and maybe don't have the labour to deal with such a seemingly manic situation, would just put plastic down to kind of kill off anything that's not the crop plant, but that has damaging effects to the soil life. You need diversity of plants there to be beneficial for your soil. So this should have a better longer term impact on the soil than just having, say, tomatoes or aubergines in one bed. So in this section along the south facing wall, we've been planting a mixture of fruit bushes and fruit trees. Here we've got raspberries, which we picked up from a dump pile out of the garden next door. And we've just trying to help them spread. So we've been kind of replanting them as they pop up. Behind that we have a couple green gages, and in other areas along the south facing wall we've also got figs, apricots and plum cots, and a couple warmth loving pears. And in between each of those planted fruit tree sections, we've kept some of the native older fruits. So we've got elder bush here, which produces a lot of elder flowers and berries throughout the year. And then behind we've got rosehip and horbury. And so each of those three are both great food for wildlife, as well as for us when we need it. So yeah, we harvest the elderberries and the hawthorn and the rosehip for kind of winter syrups. So this is our fresh crop of salad that should keep us going through into winter until it's killed off by the frosts in theory. Now that it was quite late planted, it shouldn't bolt, and it should last over winter. And then in front we've got again our chicory, which will be our winter salad as well. And so just from this one small bed of lettuce leaves we can get multiple kilos a week off it. Which should keep us going until we plant out, probably this week or next, our winter salad into the polytunnels, which will then kind of create the bridge through winter to keep us going. In the beds behind us we did quite a late sowing of carrots, which are only just coming up, and so they might be a little late, but we might try and cover them with fleece and see how they go. Behind there's the tall plants among the bamboo was sweet peas, and they are now going to seed, so we'll save the seed off all of those to grow into next year. And then going round, we've also got some sheep's wool in the bags that we get off the estate locally, and that is used into our compost system. It's the daggings of the sheep, and we have a system of compost bays that we turn 2 or 3 times, and at the end of it get a good bit of compost to add to our garden. And so far we've been producing enough as we've been growing on a smaller area, but as we're expanding within the walled garden, we don't quite keep up to the compost needs of the garden. And because we're quite small, but as we're a smaller scale garden, that we can't financially afford to put aside that space. So we try and incorporate it by undersowing with clover and other species to try and keep the soil health up. It would be great if we could buy in some other organic matter such as cow manure or horse manure, but there's no one surrounding us that is doing things organically, and so it's very difficult to bring that in, especially as nitrogen fertilizer prices have gone up. It means that other larger farmers are keeping hold of their manure, which they need, and we don't want to run the risk of using non-organic, which could bring in pesticides and cause kind of a drop in yields or just kill crops outright. And so this greenhouse isn't used quite as much anymore. It used to be used for propagation, but it's quite a good space for drying crops now. So we bring our onion harvest in here and shallots, and later in the year we'll bring the squash in. It has a much drier atmosphere than the tunnels, which can stay quite humid, and so the squash doesn't want that humidity, and neither do the onions really. And so this is a really nice space to be kind of preserving those harvests. And so in another polytunnel here, we've got our cucumbers. So we've tried to stagger our production this year with early, mid-season and then later cucumbers, just because they can go through kind of big peaks and then just drop off. And so we tried to stagger the harvest rather than having all of them sown at the same time and getting kind of maximum yield for a couple of weeks in the middle of the season where we have just too many cucumbers all at once. So we're trying to stagger it to keep it manageable. And also in here I've got agretti, which goes into the salad bags early in the season, and then we save the seed, and we keep doing that year on year. At the ends of the tunnels, I tried to fill the space with a mixture of nice flowering plants but also herbs. So we've got a lot of sage, mint and thyme, marjoram, and try and keep some weeds growing happily. So the teasel is really nice for birds in winter with the seeds, and also the bees love the flowers earlier on. And then ragwort here is great for cinnabar moth. The caterpillars love this plant. It's one of the only ones they eat, and the cinnabar moth is, it's lovely to have around. And then here we've got our bed of comfrey, which just have incredibly large root systems, and so you can be. We've had 2 or 3 cuts off this year, and it'll just keep coming back. And the comfrey leaves that we have, we either make into a tea to spread onto the plants as a fertilizer, or we just lay on the floor as kind of a mulch underneath other plants, or sometimes just add it to our compost heaps if we've got too much. So in here we've got propagation. So this is where we start all our seeds. We've got a heat mat, and we use some hanging tables as a bit of a mouse deterrent, because they're quite keen to eat seeds, especially early in the season, like January, February, March, when there's not much else around outside. The mice come in and like to devour everything. But so anything that's especially tasty to them, we put up on the hanging tables. And then the heat mat we use end of January through till about end of April to get the kind of really early stuff started and healthy. So like the tomatoes, aubergines, peppers, but also beetroots, kale, other things, just to try and get a really early crop. Because we are smaller scale, we try and get multiple crops per year on the same bed. And to do that, you really need a good propagation setup, which involves a very early starting. You kind of try and work against the seasons a little bit sometimes to try and get things running as fast as they can before they can go into the ground when temperatures are perfect. Whereas if you had to wait for temperatures to be ideal in the soil, then you can probably only get one crop, which is just not financially possible on a small scale garden like this. The things that we have propagating are some spring onions for outside, which will sit in the ground. They should be able to grow just enough in the next month or two to then survive winter and follow through into next year to harvest as spring onions. And we've also got a lot of stuff for the polytunnels, so a lot of salad leaves, spinach, chard, perpetual spinach and kales and spring greens. And behind there we've got a little crop of cucumbers, but I think going into next year we'll try and expand our propagation area and try and push into also growing some plants for plant sales, which is usually quite another good source of income. So in front of propagation here we've got more pollinator attracting plants, so more borage, rudbeckia and some lemon balm which we use in water, and it's just when it starts to flower it's nice also for the bees. And behind me apple mint and other mints in this area. The section's a slight mess at the moment, but this is where we just keep our crates for harvesting and store our compost bags for propagation, and then the tool shed over there has a little bit of water catchment for a little bit of watering in the propagation area, and just where we keep our tools out of the rain. So I started farming about 8 years ago now. Initially, while I was halfway through doing a PhD at the University of Bristol, so I was researching rainfall using Met Office radars, and I was starting to find that a mixture of a bit boring, but also I was just constantly inside during winter. I'd be going to the office at 8 in the morning and then the sun would be up at 8:30, and I'd spend the whole of the daylight hours indoors with artificial lighting. I started to feel very unnatural and not a good way of life. It means you don't sleep very well if you've not used your body physically during the day, and if you're just kind of mentally there, it doesn't really work. And so I started to look into other ways that I could work that would be better for both me but also the environment collectively. So after finding out about farming as another way of life, I got into it through woofing. I volunteered at a few farms in England, and then from there went off into Spain and to France and to other countries, seeing different bits of Europe and how they farmed, and then came back to England and did a traineeship at Tolhurst Organics and an apprenticeship at Sutton in south of London. From there, I went on with my partner to try and set up a farm in Cornwall on a bit of land that we could rent for free, and it seemed like a very good opportunity. We had a market to sell to, but the trouble with that market in Cornwall is that it's a very seasonal market where there's a lot of tourists and a lot of people with second homes, and so it only exists during the summer. But the other side of that is that also, because of those second homes, it's very expensive to try and live there, which is often the case in the countryside nowadays, where there is very little accommodation on an offer, and what is incredibly expensive to buy, and there's usually very little rental accommodation. And when you're trying to set up a farm, you're often putting your own money in and not getting anything back. So for that first year, we made enough to pay off the initial cost of the farm, but not anything at all for our wages. Even though we put in long hour days for many days a week, it's a struggle to make it work as a kind of a new entrant farmer. And so after that, I came here 3 years ago, and this had the benefit of being paid employment. And at the time, the farm wasn't bringing in much money. It was still at very early stages, so it had only really been going as a commercial setup for the year before, and even only really toward the end of that year. And so as I've been here with the help of Tim as the assistant grower, and he's spent now 3 years here as well, we've managed to turn it into a place that is getting toward being commercially viable. We're producing a much bigger income from selling the vegetables, but it's still very difficult to make it profitable because there's just so many overhead costs of insurance for the car and the farm, and there's all the seeds, the compost. Even saving our own seeds is only a proportion of what we can do. It's very difficult to grow all of your own seeds, and seed sowing compost is a different thing to our homegrown compost. And so there's a lot of factors that make it very difficult to work on this small scale, and so this is where it often involves unpaid or very cheap labour. And so it's very rare for farmers to be paid more than the minimum wage at the best. And so really there needs to be more government subsidies going to small-scale farms. Only recently they've changed the acreage payments so that you can be earning subsidies on less than 5 acres, but the amount you get from it is very small compared to what you really need to make it work. There needs to be a lot more help, but also really either, if there aren't subsidies, veg prices and food prices kind of need to go up in order to pay for the amount of labour that is needed to run a farm like this. And so the government really needs to be subsidising operations like this more, because they provide such a wide range of benefits. So we're not just feeding the local areas, so we do markets in 3 local villages near us, and also sell to shops in Bristol and veg boxes locally for collection and a bit of delivery. We sell locally, but also we offer volunteer opportunities. So we are teaching people how to farm and how to look after themselves through healthy food and a different way of living. We are also massively helping with biodiversity. So there's a lot more birds and different insects in our garden because we have the diversity of plant species and diversity of flowers and different sorts of nectar. In the compost we have grass snakes, and they always lay their eggs in there every year, and we see them out in the garden during the rest of the year. So they try and keep on top of some of our vole populations. We have also hedgehogs in the garden, and you always see kestrels and buzzards and sparrowhawks around, and so we have this diversity that you don't get to the same extent from monoculture crops. So whereas the government is currently giving some subsidies to farms with massive acreages who are spraying their fields with glyphosate, we don't get that for some reason, even though we're having all of these benefits we are benefiting the economy. If we're providing food that is healthy, then we're reducing the need for people to go to hospitals, so reducing healthcare costs. So we are kind of subsidising it through our own labour really, whereas the government should really be helping us with that.